A year ago, my husband got a new boss that he hates. At the annual holiday party, I met him for the first time and he's an ex-boyfriend of mine. I'm scared of how my husband will react. My husband is 30 and I am 29, and he hates his boss. I mean loathes him and has since he was transferred to his division almost a year ago. He would come home almost every single night complaining about him. He works in a very specific creative job, and there are very limited jobs in this area for his field of work. He is paid very well for his job, and if he wanted to stay in the same field, he most likely would have to move halfway across the country, but all our family and friends live close to us, so none of us want to do that. It had gotten so bad that he was looking at quitting and just taking a cut in pay. I told him I was fine with it, but he spent his entire life studying for this job. So, his company has an annual holiday party, and last year we were out of town, so we did not attend. This year, however, they had it this past weekend, and we were available to go. This is a very large corporation, so there are literally hundreds of people at this party. When we go in, we start to talk to people, and I go sit down at our table while he goes to meet with some of the people who work in his division who are standing at the bar. While I'm sitting there, I feel a tap on my shoulder, and there stands Paul. I have not seen Paul in years, and I immediately got up and we hugged each other. Paul and I used to date in college, and we parted amicably because we both were going to separate places in life. But we did date for over a year, and as I said, I hadn't seen him in a very long time. So, I was thrilled to see him again and catch up on our lives. I have no feelings for him other than that of an old friend, and I just was happy to catch up. We talked for a good long time until he asked me why I was there, and I said I was there with my husband. Yes, you can see where this is going. Paul, my ex, is the boss that my husband hates. He asked who my husband was, and I said his name, and Paul kind of looked stunned and asked if it was the same person he knew, and I said I didn't know. He said he was the department head of, title of job, and that is when it struck me that this was the boss my husband had been complaining about for the past year or so. He just said that he knew my husband and didn't say anything else. We continued to talk for a while, and he said he would love to speak more with me, but he had to go back to his table as he was one of the speakers for the night. We both hugged each other and he left. My husband walked up just as we're pulling apart from our very platonic hug. As Paul walked away, my husband asked me what that was all about. I could tell he was very upset, and he asked if Paul was trying to hit on me. He of course has no idea we knew each other. He was starting to rant and rave about going to HR to file a complaint on him. I mean, he was fuming mad. I was kind of stuck because if I didn't step up and say something, I think he would have gone over to the HR table and filed a complaint right there and then. I just told him that we were old friends from college and that we hadn't seen each other since graduation. I could see the color drain from his face. We spent the rest of the night with him watching his phone and leaving right after eating. He did not say a word to me on the way home. Once we got home, I tried just talk in general and he wasn't having any of it. I got the grilling of a lifetime. I could tell he was completely unhinged. He wanted to know why I didn't tell him I knew him. He went on to accuse me of laughing at him behind his back. He even went so far as to ask me if I was having an affair with him. I mean, he was in a total meltdown. This is not normal for him, in case you are wondering. He is honestly the most rational person I know, and he has never even so much as raised his voice to me in all of the years I've known him. He did eventually apologize to me, and then went on to continue to talk about how his life was hell because of his boss. Now here's the issue. I was absolutely petrified to tell him the real truth about Paul. He was completely irrational, and I was honestly afraid he would have spiraled out of control if I told him that Paul was more than just an old friend, but was actually an ex. I was not afraid for myself, by the way. I never feared that at all. But I honestly don't know mentally if he could have handled it at that moment. I think he might have done something irrational to himself or our relationship. I never hid this relationship from him. Neither of us have ever asked about previous relationships. I only know about one of his previous girlfriends because her sister said hi to her when we were at McDonald's. He knows nothing about any of my previous exes. We've both agreed that the past didn't matter. Well, I have a feeling it's going to matter. I am deathly afraid that Paul will say something to him now, not in a mean way, but just in a passing way, that we used to be a couple. I have no idea how my husband will handle this. He is the love of my life, and I do not want to hurt him. I don't want to hide this from him nor lie by omission. But I am very much afraid what this will do to him mentally. I am open to any suggestions here. Also, please don't think poorly of my husband. He is a great guy and has been more than anything I could have ever dreamed of as a partner. But whatever Paul has done over the last year has just made him insane. Best comments. OP answer a couple of questions. Why does he hate Paul so much? I honestly don't know the entire reason. I know some of it is he is critical of his work, which before I knew who it was always seemed very weird to me. My husband has won 2 national awards in his field for his work. He has been promoted inside his company faster than anyone from his field, and I know the hours of dedication he has put into it. I know he has forced him to work hours that go above and beyond what he is supposed to. I mean, the description of Paul by my husband is not the guy I dated years ago. However, that really is a big part of this. It was years ago. I don't know him at all and haven't spoken to him in almost 10 years. My wild-ass guess is that Paul knew your husband was married to you, and that's why he is treating him the way he is. It sounds like you don't really understand what all your husband has had to put up with Paul. Also, this story feels like a nightmare for your husband. I mean the kind where you wake up screaming kind. If your husband stays at that job, it is going to cause a serious shitstorm in all your lives. Several people have said this. I'll be honest, I don't know. I mean, we have not spoken or texted or anything in nearly 10 years. We did not part on bad terms at all, so it's not like I dumped him while he wanted to stay together. We both knew that after graduation we would be heading towards different paths. In all honesty, I just assumed he lived on the other side of the country. Also, my husband and I have been married for longer than he has worked in that department. So, if he had access to my husband's personnel file, which I don't know why he would have, I am only listed as an emergency contact and I have my husband's last name. But I guess it is not out of the realm of possibilities. If that is the case, and if this is some kind of vendetta, then my husband should take this to HR. How he would ever prove that, though, I don't know. Also, frankly, Paul looked surprised when I said who I was married to. I guess he could be a great actor, but he genuinely looked surprised. Honestly, I think you should tell him about Paul being your ex, explain to him that everything was just a big coincidence. And maybe help your husband get over his hatred of Paul for his sake. If your husband is a rational man, I don't think you have anything to worry about. Obviously, I have to tell him. But helping him get over his hatred of him, that part honestly, I just don't know about. Is my husband a rational man? Without a doubt, until it comes to Paul. I think me doing anything to minimize his feelings about Paul will only make the matter worse. I think if I said anything it would come off as me defending Paul, and then I think my husband would feel very isolated and hurt. I want neither. Is Paul married? Yes, his wife was with him at their table. I only saw her from a distance, but she was very pretty and elegant looking. Update: 8 days after the first post. After posting what I posted and reading a lot of the replies, I knew that I had no choice but to tell him, and to tell him the very next day. There is a lot of preambles that needs to be said here, and I will get to it below, but let me just get to how this went down for those of you who are only interested in hearing what happened. He came home. I had supper prepared. He was in a fairly good mood, which at first I thought would make this a little easier, but in retrospect it did not. In fact, it made it worse because I hated seeing the happy look dissolve. After dinner, I took him to the living room and sat him on the couch. I had a pretty lengthy speech prepared. It was a combination of facts and, well, honestly, a list of all of the great things about him that I love, knowing that I was going to have to be there to support him. He pretty much cut off my flowery speech and just said to say what I was going to say, because whatever it was I was trying to say obviously was important. So, I just said it. I just said, look, I didn't tell you that night because I was very much afraid of how you were going to take this, but Paul and I dated for almost over a year in college. I had no idea he was the Paul you were complaining about. I didn't even know he lived around here. I have not had contact with him prior to the Christmas party for almost 10 years, and even that night I had no idea who he was in relation to you until just literally moments before you came over. He just sat there for what seemed like forever, and then all he said was, "I understand." That was it. It was monotone and passionless. I asked him if he believed me about the time frame and that I did not know who he was that night. He said, yes, that was it. So, I now go into my speech about how embarrassed I am about all of this. That under no circumstance on the planet would I ever do anything to jeopardize our marriage. That he was my number one focus, and then I started talking about how much I loved him and would do whatever he wanted to do, even if it meant moving or doing something different. While I was talking, he stood up and said that he would like to be alone for a while and that he needed to leave to do this. Like an idiot, I start crying. I tell him that if he needed to be alone, that is fine, but I would be happy to leave, and he said no, he wanted to go out to clear his head. He left in his car. I waited for a little bit, not nearly as long as I should have, I'm sure, but I then started texting him telling him how much he meant to me. Telling him that I would answer any question, and well, you can imagine all of the things I texted. He never replied. He left the house somewhere around 7:30 p.m. At 10:30, I received a phone call from a number that I do not know, but I did not want to be tied up hoping that he might call me. At a little after 11, I saw car lights pull in the driveway, so I was thinking he was back, but then the doorbell rang. There is no worse feeling on the planet Earth than having two state troopers with their hats in hand at your door. As soon as I opened the door, I started screaming and crying. One of the troopers told me that my husband had been involved in serious auto accident and that I needed to either go with them to the hospital or have someone take me. Obviously, I am hysterical at this point and am asking them if he is dead. The one trooper said that they did not believe he was, but they were notified by the hospital to notify me because they couldn't get in touch with me. The number I ignored was the ER calling me. I grabbed my phone and went with them to the hospital. On the way, I called his parents and told them to meet me there. I called my parents to let them know, but they were out of town for a few days, so I left a voice message. I got to the ER and the troopers took me in through a back door as to avoid having to go to a desk, and my heart is about to explode, and they tell a nurse who I am, and she walks over and pulls back a curtain, and there sat my husband in an ER bed. He was awake and held up his arm to show me his cast. I was both relieved and overcome all at the same time. Of course, I held him and bawled for quite a long time. He apologized for scaring me and said he would have called me, but his phone was still in the car. I asked him what happened, and he said he hit some ice on the road and lost control, then slid off hitting a tree. He said he thought the car was totaled. The rest was pretty much a blur, but eventually once his parents got there, I left them in there with him to call my parents again to update them. That is when the state trooper approached me and wanted to talk. He said that while they can't totally dispute what my husband was saying, that his story about ice did not hold up. Yes, it had snowed lightly, but there was no real ice on the road, and that there was no evidence at the scene to show where my husband attempted to either brake or swerve. They also said that the only reason his injury was as minor as it was because of the airbags, because they do not believe he was wearing a seat belt. At first, I had no clue as to what they were trying to say, but ultimately it sunk in that they were implying he tried to delete himself. No matter how bad this made me feel, and believe me, I felt like shit, my top priority at this point was him. So, I went back into the room with him, and mind you, he is acting like everything is fine, like our conversation from earlier didn't even happen. In fact, he was definitely overcompensating, trying to act happy and nonchalant. Stuck with him in the room for a while, and then eventually went out and spoke to his mom. She was fully aware of everything. I had confided in her after I got off of work because she and I have a great relationship, and I wanted her advice on how to handle this. She was a wealth of information and was very supportive that afternoon. I told her what the troopers told me. She said we should ask the doctor if there was any way to tell if this might be intentional. We spoke with the doctor, then he spoke with the troopers. I went in to speak to my husband and see how he was doing, and finally the doctor came in and started questioning my husband, and he started to get very defensive. Finally, he asked why he wasn't wearing a seat belt, and he started to give some excuse, but looked at me and he saw I was crying and just mouthed to him to please be honest. After denying it for a good long while, he finally admitted that he was just reckless. Since there was no real proof that he tried to harm himself, the doctor told us that there was nothing he could do. He said he could not justify an emergency detention order, and that while he tends to believe us, there is just not enough to work with. He was, however, admitted for 23-hour observation. He ended up with a fracture to his right forearm and bruising to his chest wall. I stayed with him, and his dad went over the next morning to the wrecker service to get his things from the car. When we went home, he went from overcompensating to him turning on me, accusing me of trying to have him committed in the ER. He became very mean and isolated himself in our bedroom for the next day. Eventually, he came out to eat, and that is when he dropped his request for a divorce on me. As you can imagine, I was a little distraught, but I told him that he needed to focus on getting better before we make any kind of decisions or even talk about it. The next day, he just let me have it. He totally believes that Paul and I have been conspiring against him for over a year. That the reason Paul has been so bad to him is because of me. He basically said a lot of vile, mean shit, and well, frankly, he was not the man who I knew and loved at that moment. I let him say whatever he wanted to say and didn't argue with him. After he settled down, I just asked him to explain logically how I manipulated him into this department in order to get him to work for someone I didn't even know was there. Obviously, he couldn't, but that didn't make him any more rational or less angry. The next day was a little better. He did apologize. I told him that of course I accepted his apology, but that I wasn't going to take being called those vile names by anyone, let alone my own husband. We both agreed to just let him heal and not to bring up divorce in the meantime. Later in the day, he agreed to go to marriage counseling, and I told him that he needed individual therapy for himself because it wasn't healthy to be this angry. Also, I want him to be able to admit what his parents, the state troopers, the ER doctor, and myself all believe. He tried to delete himself that night. My heart sinks typing that, and I cannot tell you the damage this has done to my own emotions and to our marriage. However, I am committed to making this work. This is not him. This is him having a psychotic break, but he is not himself. I will stand by him throughout this, even if he have to be angry at me for some time. I know I did not do anything wrong, but I also understand from his point of view this all looks very suspicious. Best comments. OP answer a couple of questions. He has to resign. If he doesn't get distance from his boss, he will continue to destroy himself and drag you down as well. I'm going to bring that up in therapy with him. I think we need a clean breakaway. I know he does not want to move from his family, but it might be the best thing for us. Have you not considered approaching HR? You seem to not be very concerned with actually making Paul responsible. This is a minefield, to be honest with you. I would go in a heartbeat if I thought for a minute I had any type of physical proof of any improprieties. But all that I have is my husband's verbal complaints. He is salaried, so working over on the weekends and late at nights is just part of it. If I went and did this behind my husband's back, it is very possible that if there is no finding in his favor, he could be the one punished. Your husband feels completely emasculated. The person he hates, who is his superior that he has to obey at work, who is threatening his career and livelihood, also used to have sex with his wife. I think your husband has to choose between his career and his wife, but both choices seem to be a lose-lose situation for him. His career will still be painful to pursue, and his wife's history will always haunt him. I'm sorry. I feel confident that your perception is correct. However, I will not just sit idly by and have our fate decided for us over something I had no control over.